Hello and welcome to Perspectives in Professional Psychology. I'm Dr. Lance Garrison, Dean of the College of Professional Psychology at the Chicago School. Join me as we explore the cutting-edge work of our faculty, alumni, and students across a diverse array of specialty within the fields of professional psychology. On this episode of Perspectives in Professional Psychology, I had the honor of speaking with Dr. Nahed Noot. Dr. Nasrat joined the Chicago School as a professor of clinical psychology in 2019. She received her master's degree and her doctorate in clinical psychology from Alliant International University. Aside from her teaching and mentoring of students for the past 20 years, Dr. Nasrat is a diversity expert, providing training and conducting research on diversity issues in clinical psychology, including refugees and immigrants' mental health, as well as psychosocial issues in conflict and post-conflict countries. Dr. Nasrat was the recipient of an Outstanding Dissertation Award, which was a clinical manual for mental health professionals working with Afghan refugee women. Dr. Nasrat is the past president of the American Psychological Association's Division 48, which is the Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict, and Violence. Dr. Nasrat is the recipient of the 2015 Ignacio Matambarro Lifetime Peace Practitioner Award, which was presented by the Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict, and Violence in recognition of her lifetime achievement as a peace practitioner. In 2016, she received the Anthony J. Marcella Prize for the Peace of Psychology and Social Justice, which recognized her for her outstanding psychology-based contributions and scholarship and actions in peace, human rights, and social actions. She's also the recipient of the National Colleges and Schools of Professional Psychology 2016 Diversity Award, which recognized her academic and research contributions, as well as her community and globally based work and her investment in mentorship training and development of students and professionals from marginalized populations. Dr. Nasrat is also the recipient of the 2020-2021 Distinguished Multicultural Teaching Excellence Award. Dr. Nasrat serves as the Vice President of the Afghan for Education for a Better Tomorrow, a nonprofit organization which provides health and education services in Afghanistan. She's a member of the Executive Board of the Afghan American Women's Association. She serves as the co-chair of the Afghanistan Mental Health Work Group at the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, where she helps Afghanistan's Ministry of Public Health establish and reconstruct mental health services and develop mental health capacity. Dr. Nasrat has frequently appeared on international TV and radio talk shows discussing the impacts of a culture of stress on immigrants and refugees' mental health, and published book chapters and numerous articles on the status of Afghan women's mental health and human rights. We had an insightful and engaging conversation on the topic of peace psychology, and I certainly hope you enjoy learning from Dr. Nasrat as much as I did. Hello, Dr. Nasrat. I appreciate you joining us today in Perspectives in Professional Psychology. So I know you're one of our clinical psychology faculty members, so would you just take a moment to tell us a little bit about your background and your role with the Chicago School?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Garrison, for inviting me to this conversation. And really, I'm delighted to have this conversation with you. My name is Dr. Nahed Nasrat. I'm a clinical psychology faculty at the Chicago School in Washington, D.C. I have been there since 2019. Prior to that, I was with the American School of Psychology, professional psychology. So I've been in the field for over 20 years, teaching and training doctoral clinical psychology students.
Fantastic. Now, if I am understanding correctly, you have an interest and a background in an area of psychology called liberation psychology. So could you tell us a little bit about what liberation psychology is and how maybe it differs from, our traditional notions of psychology?
course, with pleasure. But before I do that, I want to give you an anecdote first in terms of how I became interested, because it's always a personal story, personal anecdotes, and lived experiences that motivate us to go into a specific direction in psychology. So I am a refugee. I still consider myself a refugee from Afghanistan. And my lived experiences of forced escape and forcing my family to leave illegally the country really shaped my views of the world, as well as my look at the human suffering, right? What may be the causes of human suffering? Even you and I may see what the person from different angles. You may end up conceptualizing the depressive symptoms, for example, as a result of certain family issues or so on, but then focusing on individual responsibility, how to cope with it. So my issue in traditional psychology was that what about the socio-political issues? What about the socio-cultural, contextual issues that may impact the well-being, mental health, and as well as overall collective well-being of a nation, a marginalized community, and so on. So throughout my training in clinical psychology, this component was really missing, and I became very critical of it. And because I wasn't able to see, in fact, the suffering of marginalized communities being explained from a more valid or kind of collective approach, right? And so I, obviously through many of my professional involvement, I became very familiar with liberation psychology. And so basically, liberation psychology is a framework within psychology that focuses on understandings and addressing the psychological impacts of oppression, inequality, inequity, and social injustice in societies. And of course, power dynamics, right? So if there is an imbalance, even then, of course, it impacts our mental health. There's plenty of empirical evidence that has shown that any kind of ism, whether it's discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia, any kind of classism, right, may have direct impact on our well-being and how we feel about ourselves, self-worth, and also how we show up in a society. So therefore, unlike traditional psychology, which often centers on the individual pathology and personal mental health, liberation psychology emphasizes collective well-being. So if we don't have a social well-being, when our society's health is not good, we directly suffer as an individual. Right. So if society becomes healthy and we can obtain social health when there is no discrimination, there is really equality and equity, right? And all the isms kind of disappear, hopefully one day. And so therefore, and there is social justice. So the liberation of marginalized groups really depends on those components, whether they are absent or present in a society. It also integrates social, cultural, and political context. Psychology in general has kind of claimed to be apolitical, but we know that clinical work is political work, right? If we don't do advocacy, we don't have any funding. So we kind of suffer from a little bit of a confusion in terms of why we don't necessarily name that as a political aspect. Human suffering is also influenced by political inequalities and so on. And so liberation psychology departs from traditional psychological prioritization of individual and the attribution of individuals' distress to pathology within the individual, right? So what is really causing my, depression, anxiety, and so on? One would argue that, well, I need to cope with whatever is distressing me, but liberation psychology would say you need to heal. Right? Coping is just not addressing the source of the issue that is causing you the distress and problems. So if there's inequality and I'm just teaching you how to cope with it, what becomes of me as a psychologist, as a professional? So I may also become complacent about inequality. Of course, I cannot get rid of all inequalities, but I need to have a very specific intention to not only address that, but also collaborate with the client, if that makes sense. So liberation psychology seeks to understand the person within their socio-political, cultural, and historical context. And therefore, distress is understood not solely in intrapsychic terms, but also in the context of oppression and oppressive environment that psychologizes and individualizes distress, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, two thoughts come to mind as you talked about, you know, what liberation psychology is. One is kind of historically the rise of clinical psychology as a profession has its roots kind of firmly planted in the Western world, right? And I think that the focus in clinical psychology has been very individual and not more collectivist. It hasn't accounted as much for those factors historically. So I can see a real place of importance for the underpinnings of liberation psychology within training of clinical psychologists and the actual practice of clinical psychology. The other thing that struck me was the power dynamic, you know, point that you brought up. And what's so interesting about that is that in training of clinical psychologists, we talk a lot about power dynamics, but we talk about it in the context of the clinician-patient relationship and taking great care to avoid some of the pitfalls of the power differential in that situation. But for the life of me, I cannot recall a more in-depth or meaningful discussion about the impact of power dynamics from a social cultural perspective for the individuals coming to see us. So again, I think that the kind of the concept and the underpinnings of liberation psychology can be really important as a point of training for clinical psychologists more broadly. So having touched on that, could you talk a little bit about where liberation psychology comes from, its kind of historical and cultural origin story, for lack of a better phrase?
Yes, absolutely. And I think liberation psychology really emerged in the response of historical and cultural context that was characterized by widespread social injustice. And particularly, there were some key factors that contributed to its development. And that was one was related to the political and social upheaval in Latin America, particularly in reaction to military dictatorships. As we know, when there is dictatorship, right, it affects our mental health, our freedom of movement, our spirits, our well-being. And so in the 1960s and 70s, Latin America experienced significant political instability. And I'm just focusing on that because this theory basically emerged from liberation theology, which I will shed light onto a little bit more. And so the military regimes engaged in widespread human rights abuses, and countries like Argentina, Chile, Brazil were all under authoritarian rules and leading to mass oppression, torture, and disappearance of descendants, right? So that really impacted people's well-being, that brought stress, psychological issues, and when you don't have freedom, your spirit basically in many ways can die, so to speak. And then there was also another component that really helped develop liberation psychology was revolutionary movements. That was the period also saw revolutionary movements and armed struggles against oppressive governments such as the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua and Cuban revolution. And these movements highlighted the need for psychological approaches that address the realities of political and social upheaval. And then finally, there was the influence of liberation theory, and that was very much determined by the liberation theology. And so the link with Central America is through that liberation theology. You see, even though liberation psychology is used now in every corner of the globe, obviously, but the importance of understanding the historical context is really crucial. So the Christian theological perspective, which emerged in Latin America, emphasized the importance of social justice and liberation as of oppressed people. And so it really influenced many scholars and activists to address that. And Ignacio Martin Baró, who was a Spanish-born Jesuit priest that worked in Central America, and he came to the United States, the University of Chicago University, to study psychology. And then when he was educated and trained, and he said, "This is it. So how do I really address the human suffering?" So from a Western perspective, it doesn't really address the sociocultural, sociopolitical issues. So as a Jesuit priest, he really was immersed into issues related to social injustice and how to address that within the community, marginalized communities. And so that's how he founded liberation psychology. And so there was also another component that really helped to immerse liberation psychology was critique of traditional psychology. You alluded to Eurocentrism to some degree, right? So I think we call it more about mainstream psychology, because the tradition of Western psychology was critiqued by its Eurocentric bias, that seeing from the lens of because of the theories can be applied to everyone, just because of my reality may also be applicable to all. But it was not intentional in a way to be malignant or so on, but that was the reality at that time. And so there was certain biases that emerged from that, and people suffered as a result of, like, how I show anger within my cultural context can be completely normal when you're not aware of my cultural context, and you may see me as aggressive or as really weird or awkward or a lot of other psychological biases that can go into. So unless we understand that behavior within the cultural context, we can really be very much oppressive, toward clients. And then there was also a reaction to focus on individualism, right? So the mainstream psychology was often criticized for its focus on individual pathology rather than systemic issue, right? So yes, I may play a role in my own suffering, but it's really the systemic issues that can impact my well-being and my healing in the society. So it sought to shift the focus towards understanding how systemic issues and oppression and social context can affect mental health and well-being and social well-being in general. And then finally, there was cultural movement, right? So psychology for a long period of time was acultural, neutral. Then there was, the more people claim to be objective, they were seen as really experts, but there is no such thing as 100% objectivity. So objective to whose eyes, right? So cultural psychology emerged, and that really helped shape also liberation psychology, that they're basically going from the notion that every culture has its own deep wisdom of healing practices, and that needs to be incorporated, integrated in the broader view, and when it comes to addressing human suffering. And then finally, the human rights and social justice movement, as I alluded earlier, is really shaped the 20th century to address the, what does it do to human psyche when there are human rights abuses, right? So when we talked about gender discrimination, homophobia, inequality of gender, marriage, and so on earlier before we had same-sex marriage, all of that really impacts the person's view of themselves and also their mood, their state of functioning. So yeah, these are some of the factors that really impacted the emergence of liberation psychology.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because one of the things about the practice of clinical psychology, with all of its many well-established benefits, is that I've always felt in some ways some of what we're doing in therapy is helping people acculturate or even assimilate. And sometimes, and I think this is, from what I'm hearing, this is what liberation psychology addresses. sometimes it's just not a good context to acculturate to or to try to
Mhm.
assimilate with. And that real traditional clinical psychology focused is about, okay, well, let's take a look at your current circumstances and how do we
Mhm.
help you better cope with that? And
Yes.
that
Yeah.
that makes sense, right? I mean, we still need that, but you can't necessarily just ask someone to do that to a context that is dehumanizing, that
Yeah.
is discriminatory.
Mm.
We shouldn't expect people to find a way to be okay with that,
Yeah.
to assimilate or to acculturate to that. And I feel like
Yeah.
liberation psychology helps bring that broader context to it.
Yeah, and I think this is such an important issue that you brought up, with neurodivergent population, right? So, for example, if there are certain learning disabilities, are we really teaching them how to adjust and acculturate to the mainstream that we have not been able to actually address their needs, right? They're
Right.
just different in
Yeah.
terms of how they show up, how they perceive the world, how they analyze the world. But we're telling them, be like us, right? So
Yeah.
really is that really affects it has nothing to do with just marginalized communities, but any marginalization
Yeah.
that a person presents. Really, liberation psychology is important. So we talk about the sociopolitical context of neurodiversity, right?
Mm.
So what does the society do to address your needs and not turn you into one of us,
Right.
right? And that's really important because otherwise I will become dehumanized. I will have to lose part of me, of myself, in order to be like you.
Yeah.
And it's such an important aspect, especially in today's society. How do we
Oh,
still
for sure.
maintain our dignity and humanity?
And that's where that education and advocacy piece comes in, right? That I think, and psychologists traditionally have not been great at this, at least in my
Yeah,
opinion. It's not, we work with individuals and like we said, we often try to get them to be like us.
yeah,
But there's sometimes that's not reasonable. And so from an education and an advocacy standpoint, that's where I think clinical psychologists have a responsibility to do more on the public end of things, to
absolutely.
help the broader community understand um, the value of the uniqueness that each people brings to the culture, to the community, and that it is okay to be different. And we need to work as a society on being better about accepting and welcoming those differences because that diversity, that divergence from the broader social norm is good. And it's part of what makes us better and stronger as a society.
Yeah. I think, Dr. Garrison, you're by heart a liberation psychologist. The way I
I
listen
didn't
to
know it
you.
before our conversation today.
It makes sense, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So you early on, you talked a little bit about your own refugee experience. Could you
Mhm.
touch on what some of the unique psychological challenges are for refugees and how liberation psychology works with those individuals to help them?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, we need to acknowledge that the suffering of refugees is not something that is in their hands, right? It
Right.
didn't really emerge because they did something wrong and they, committed something. Something really horrible happened to them, and that is with their political unrest, invasions, you name it, occupations, and so on. And so as a result, nobody, first of all, will leave their country. If I were to tell you, Dr. Garrison, you need to leave today, it would really be horrible, horrible. Nobody chooses to leave
Right.
in a way that to leave everything behind. So just to give you an anecdote, I was told by my father, who was a medical doctor, overnight, literally, to pack one dress and just leave. And we left everything behind. So I was younger. I was in my, late teenager, like, I don't know, 17 or so. But for an adult person, it's really traumatizing to leave everything behind. So then we come to a place where, because of the triple trauma paradigm, which is during, we go through trauma in the country of origin because of political unrest, invasions, occupation, and then during migration, there's additional trauma such as, being violated, being, tortured and so on. And post-migration, which is really if people are lucky enough to settle in a host country, then there's issues related to discrimination, racism, and xenophobia, and all of those things that can emerge. So then here I am, and then I go to the doctor and psychologist or psychiatrist, and they tell me I suffer from certain trauma, right? But then somehow I need to take responsibility for my trauma, even though I had not played a role in it. Right? So that's really important, understanding the refugees kind of condition. So from a traditional psychology perspective, when they go, first of all, is individual therapy. We rarely engage in that because there's insurance companies don't pay. So this is a political issue, right? We need to address that, how the insurance actually dictates us what to do and not to do. Right. So refugees, when they really experience trauma from war, persecution, and perilous journey to safety. And they may face ongoing stressors such as uncertainty about their legal status, right? So we talk a lot. And they also become, how unfortunately, kind of a political agenda, such as, they're being vilified, they're being dehumanized, and then so on. But we never ask the question, or really ask, how did they actually end up being here? What happened to them? What did we play? What kind of role did we play in that, right? In that whole journey. And so the separation from family and integration challenges in the host country are all really impacting the well-being of refugees. So traditional psychological approaches might focus on diagnosing, right, such as PTSD or trauma-related issues, and treating the symptoms. But we may actually stay away from addressing the question of the social ill, the injustice, the inequality, the discrimination, the oppression, the torture, and all of that, which really does not help the person to heal. Right? So liberation psychologists will walk on the journey of healing. That is the terminology. We're walking together on this journey of healing, not telling you as a powerful psychologist, tell you what to do, but I'm really, really with you on your journey. And I trust you that you have enough of cultural wisdom, of healing practices, that you can bring it to this, therapy session, so I can integrate and then with you come up with some solutions and so on. And I don't tell you what the solutions are, right? So I dismantle the power dynamic right there. It's a collaborative effort. So I don't overlook the broader socio-political context. Definitely is my ethical responsibility to inform myself about the socio-political context that the refugee emerged from, right? And what were the causes? What happened there? Unfortunately, we don't really talk a lot about these issues. Even in the historical context of human suffering, we don't even integrate in the psychotherapeutic kind of interventions. So it encourages refugees to see their struggle not just as a personal failing, but as responses to unjust conditions. And that shifts their view, right? That somehow humanizes you and say, oh, okay, I'm normal. It's not because I did something wrong and so on. And it fosters a sense of agency and community solidarity. And let me give you an example, if you don't mind. So I'm involved in nonprofit organizations. I'm one of the co-founders of a few nonprofit organizations. And one of them that I serve as a board member is Afghan American Women Association. So we help refugees settle in. And the way we intervene is not to do psychological therapy or so on. We gather as a community, right? We share tea, we share some, sweet goods or something. So that is very culturally appropriate when we gather. And then we engage in narrative storytelling. The stories, when I listen to your story, that tells me that I'm not alone. I'm not further marginalized. I'm not further separated, alienated. So that brings a sense of community, cohesion, also normalization, but also mainly humanizing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, completely. And as you were talking, I had this kind of image in my head of traditional psychotherapy being a therapist sitting face to face with a client. And kind of, metaphorically, you talked about the journey. I think the biggest difference is we're not face to face, we're side by side, and I'm walking with you on this
Yes.
journey. And I'm here to listen, to help, to support where I can, advocate, educate, and work to smooth the path for you
Yeah.
as you go through this journey of healing.
Yes. And that's really called the accompaniment, right?
Wow.
Accompaniment, accompagnon, that's in Spanish, and it's a very humanizing kind of, when I'm in pain and I have an accompanier, it just holding hands, basically, not necessarily literally holding, but just being there in solidarity with, and I'm one of your allies, right? How wonderful when we look at the LGBTQA plus community, even though if we don't identify as a sexual minority, but we are an ally with them, that's a whole different notion when we tell them like, okay, well, your sexual orientation or gender identity, whatever it is, but how to cope with the societal oppression, that's not going to take away the pain. Right? We need to emerge and be an ally to marginalized communities. And that's really the main teaching of liberation psychology.
Fantastic. Could you touch on maybe two or three kind of proven interventions from liberation psychology that have proven effective for helping refugees overcome trauma and begin to rebuild their lives? I know you've touched on some of that, but if you were to distill that into a couple of strategies, what would that be?
Yeah, sure. So from a liberation psychology perspective, community psychology also emerged from liberation psychology. And that's really, it's community-based intervention. And it really depends on the resources and funds made available to the refugee community in the host country, right? So we know, for example, in the US, there are certain refugee communities here in Washington, DC, Virginia, Maryland. They're very well resourced, right? Depending on the fiscal budget and everything else. But there are certain communities that totally lack all the funds. So when I tell you about the psychological intervention, it's also very much dependent on what is available to them, resources. But it has been shown that liberation psychology's approach, including community-based interventions that create a safe space for them. Like, we're not alone. We walk together. We are accompanying each other and sharing their stories and experiences, really destigmatizing and really not non-pathologizing, right? So I have a story to share, and that's based on my lived experience, based on my suffering. There's also peer support groups. So for example, this nonprofit organization that I'm involved with, we don't have to have experts and professionals, right? So we actually match them with what we call peer support. And so those who have been here for an extended period of time, and they are well aware of the political issues as well as the rules and all of the things that usually newly arrived refugees don't know. We accompany them, right? We go with them to schools. We advocate for their kids, and especially when there is lack of understanding of the language, English language. So it can be facilitated by trained counselors and psychologists, but can also be facilitated and accompanied by peer support. And the reason for that is because there are not many psychologists or even counselors that quote unquote specialize in refugees' mental health, as that makes sense, even though liberation psychology really stays away from the term specialists or experts, because that denotes already a power dynamic or power differential. Participatory action research, I do that a lot, right? So historically, mainstream psychology basically emphasizes the empirical evidence going into community, obtaining data, coming out, and not even sharing with the community what they so they become like subjects. Participatory action research, I go to the community and I am just part of the community, and they come, the community members tell me what their needs are and what are the strategies, how they can help. And so collaboration, so PAR or participatory action research is also another intervention, even though you would say that is a methodology for research, but I would also say it's an intervention, psychological intervention, because what it really emerges from that is an agency and a sense of, oh, I can do that. So we spoke really about our needs, what our needs were, and we also came up with some strategies and solutions.
Yeah,
Very important.
I love that, because you think about kind of the massive knowledge base in the research literature, how much of that takes years and sometimes decades to cycle back to the communities that were initially involved in it, and that's if it ever comes back to impart any tangible benefit to the communities. I love that the concept of the action participatory research model. That makes so much sense.
And I even have to spend so much money to just get access to that article. You see what I mean?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's really not accessible. And so these are really mainstream aspects of psychology, that we need to kind of decolonize, right? So as another language of liberation psychology is how to decolonize psychology, how to incorporate. You alluded to the training of psychologists. How many textbooks of non-Western do I use in my classroom? How much of articles that were published in non-Western kind of environment or spaces am I going to include in my teaching? But yet we're also accredited by American Psychological Association. We have competencies that we need to show. So it's really, this is not to say that's not doable at all. We just need to integrate and be more creative about these issues, so we can train psychologists and students that are really well-rounded about how to address the human suffering, psychological issues from multiple angles and not just one angle.
Yeah. So it's interesting too, because I'm thinking about, what are some of the barriers to broader implementation of the principles of liberation psychology? And I know you touched on one, I think, which is funding. It's hard to get anything done if you don't have funding for it, right? And then we have this entrenched, for lack of a better word, training model that's connected to these competencies of programmatic accreditors, which are all there, for good reason.
Yes.
But can be limiting in terms of how we deliver the curriculum of clinical psychology to students as they go through the training program. But outside of those, are there some other barriers that you think impede implementation of liberation psychology with refugee populations?
Yeah, first of all, I think understanding and what the term of liberation psychology is called conscientization or conscientization, meaning becoming aware, right? It's not just the three component of cultural competency or cultural humility, skill, knowledge, and awareness. It's really becoming aware of the human suffering around the world, because if I see that person suffering in other part of the country, it may impact me also, not directly, probably indirectly, right? So that part is really important, how we teach ethnopolitical kind of issues in psychology, how, for example, historical context really impact the psychological well-being of marginalized communities today, even after 400 years, after 200 years. So I think this is really important, how we raise consciousness, and the practitioner needs to be willing, not forced. needs to be willing to go there with you in a very humanizing way, because I teach diversity. The minute I create, this is a skill you need to have in order for people who are willing to listen, to also be understood and acknowledged, because everybody has a reality, right? So it's not coming at them and telling them what to do. So that's one part that psychology really can do a better work, a better job in terms of teaching the context of sociopolitical context in our field, right? Even within the United States or around the world, even if you don't want to focus on, on the world, but here at home, we have plenty of sociopolitical context that we need to address that. So the other one is also advocacy, like you said, getting funding. It's very, very important. And a lack of trained professionals, like really familiar with liberation psychology. So I think psychology would benefit to incorporate from other theories other than the main three, orientation, psychodynamic, and CBT and family. But it's really to understand there are many other forces, fourth and fifth force in psychology, that can be included, not just in exclusion of others, right? At the cost of exclusion of others. And then finally, building partnerships. We cannot reinvent the wheel. One thing that really, really important in terms of addressing the well-being of refugees. I come in and I ask for, I submit my proposal for funding, but I ignore all the other organizations that exist that have been doing this work for a long time. So I need to be willing to collaborate and not reinvent the wheel, because it's very costly. So these nonprofit organizations that we address mental health of refugees and psychosocial well-being, we collaborate with each other. And it's a beautiful thing. We're not competitive because we're all volunteers. We're not on salaries. Obviously, that makes a lot of difference. And additionally, leveraging technology in online platforms is really, really critical. It can help reach refugees in remote and underserved, areas. I think this is a beautiful tool to be able to do that. So I'm involved in translating certain psychological, terms and into Farsi and Dari and the native language, so they can benefit. But also what I offer online is in their own native Dari or Farsi language that really impacts them. So there are language barriers that we need to address, and we need to be able to embrace diversity of languages and different clinicians and so on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking about the research base and how it's off in the ivory tower, but even if people had access to it, I don't know how accessible it is. So
100%.
I love that you're, part of that focus of liberation psychology is how do we bring the principles, the tools that are right for communities to them on their terms. And in
Yes.
ways that make it accessible and relevant contextually for them.
Yeah. But first ask them what their needs are and not assume
Yeah,
what their
good point.
needs are, right? So the actual needs versus assumed needs, they're totally different. And sometimes we may actually ignore that, not intentionally, but sometimes due to the training or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dr. Nasrat, this has been a fantastic conversation. I appreciate your time. Could you maybe share top two or three takeaways that you would like people to have from our conversation today about liberation psychology?
Of course, with pleasure. So liberation psychology is a fascinating field. I think that the more I study it, the more fascinated I become. Of course, I'm biased, but there are profound implications using this liberation psychology. And the three takeaways that I would like for your audience to remember is a focus on social justice, right? So the social injustice will really affect everyone's health and well-being. And so liberation psychology emphasizes addressing and dismantling systemic oppression. Once we go there, not that completely, because that will take many, probably centuries or decades, but at least to address that, at least to recognize that. And it's not just about individual therapy, but about understanding and transforming the societal structures that contribute to psychological suffering, right? So we need to address that. That's one takeaway that I would say. And then there are cultural relevance. These days, there's a lot of talk about cultural competency. I don't dislike the term the cultural competence, but I would like to actually refer to more cultural humility, because I come as a humble person to you, learning equally from you, not assuming that I know everything about your culture, because there is so many variations and dimensions of our intersectionality of our culture. So I would say cultural relevance is really, this approach values the importance of cultural context and local knowledge, right? And advocates for psychological practices. And finally, it's really important to empower and remind each other of our own agency, because we become dehumanized when we no longer remember our own agency. Resilience is really an important aspect of survival. And I can only survive when I'm aware of my resiliency. When I'm dehumanized, I may end up actually not believing in myself. So I hope these 2 or 3 takeaways will remind our audience to really focus, also students and those who are in training. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this conversation. It really means to me, and that we engage in this conversation, Dr. Garrison. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome, and thank you for sharing your insights and your expertise on liberation psychology. I've certainly learned a lot. I learned that maybe I am a liberation psychologist at heart, so that's good. I look forward to learning more. And again, thank you so much for joining us today on Perspectives in Professional Psychology. And I look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Thank you. It's been really my pleasure. And thank you for having me again.
Thank you for joining us on Perspectives in Professional Psychology. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep making a difference in your communities. If you would like more information about the professional psychology programs offered at the Chicago School, please visit us at thechicagoschool.edu.